Jets general manager Joe Douglas on Wednesday revealed an important member of the team will be with the Jets for another year. We'll talk about who it is and what it means for the Jets on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, March 3rd, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you for making this show your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, click the subscribe button, and you'll get notifications as new episodes are posted. You'll never miss an episode of Locked On Jets. If you're watching on YouTube and like this episode, give it a big thumbs up. It helps other Jets fans find the channel. Well, Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh had their annual pre-combine press conferences yesterday. Saleh's actually not at the combine in Indianapolis, but he did a remote availability with the media, and they made some news. Now, most of the information you get from these press conferences is pretty generic. You hear stuff about how, we want to improve the team this offseason. You'll hear, we have great opportunities, we have great resources, lots of cliches, but sometimes you get a little bit of news, and we did get a little bit of news yesterday. And perhaps the most prominent piece of news is something that I think many of us thought was obvious, but Joe Douglas confirmed it, and that is the Jets will pick up Quinnen Williams' fifth-year option. So if you're not familiar with rookie contracts, players who are selected in the first round get a 4-year deal, but there is a team option for the fifth year. There's a catch, though. The team needs to decide whether it exercises that option between the player's third and fourth season. So essentially, you're deciding a year in advance whether you're picking up the team option for the fifth year. And things have actually changed over the last couple of years. And this is one of the things that I think made the decision a little bit easier. The price of the fifth-year option used to be based on where you were drafted. So a top 10 pick would get the transition tag salary at that position as part of the fifth-year option, which is the average of the top 10 players at your position. And then players drafted 11 through 32 had a lower price tag. The new collective bargaining agreement, which sets the rules for the league, it's essentially what if you're a baseball fan, it's what's being negotiated now between the owners and players, or maybe not being negotiated between the owners and players. But again, it sets the rules of the league. And the collective bargaining agreement that was agreed to 2 years ago in the NFL changed how the fifth-year option is calculated. There's now a formula, and it's based more on player performance. So there's a level where Quinnen Williams is at where he really met none of the benchmarks. There's another level where if you played a certain amount of snaps, you get a higher salary for the fifth year. There's another benchmark where if you make a Pro Bowl, you get an even higher salary. And if you make 2 Pro Bowls, you get an even higher salary still. Now, Quinnen Williams has battled injuries during his career, and he's yet to make a Pro Bowl. And it's kind of funny because a player like Quinnen Williams is actually the type of player where the team benefits most from the new rules, because he's a good player, but he's not a great player. And under the old rules, the Jets would have had to pay Quinnen Williams the fifth-year option like he was a star-level player, and they don't really need to do that this year. This fifth-year option, overthecap.com, which does a lot of great work explaining how the NFL salary cap works, they calculate that it's going to be about $10.2 million to keep Quinnen Williams for his fifth year, which will be 2023. For a player like Quinnen Williams, that's not a bad deal. Would you want to keep Quinnen Williams on the transition tag number? That might be a different question. I don't know that you want to pay Quinnen Williams like he's a star-level player, because he really hasn't been a star-level player, except for maybe a stretch near the end of his second season. So it's a pretty good deal for the Jets, a player who gets a lot of criticism. I have to be honest with you, I've been critical of Quinnen Williams at points in the past, but really if you look at what Quinnen Williams has done, he's probably one of the better number 3 overall picks in recent memory. And I know within the fan base, there's talk, do you trade Quinnen Williams because he's been a little disappointing? I don't see the logic for that, because let's say you for some reason, this is just a hypothetical. I'm not saying Houston would be interested in him necessarily, but let's say Houston comes to you, and I don't think they would make this offer anyway, but again, it's a hypothetical. Houston comes to you and they say, we're going to give you the 3 overall pick for Quinnen Williams. It's the same pick you used to draft Quinnen Williams. Even a pick that high, the odds are against you drafting a player as good as Quinnen Williams. If you don't believe me, let's go through the number 3 overall picks the last 10 years in the NFL. You've got Trent Richardson. You've got Deion Jordan. You've got Blake Bortles. You've got Dante Fowler. You've got Joey Bosa. Okay, that's a pretty good one. Solomon Thomas. Sam Darnold. Quinnen Williams. Jeff Okudah. And Trey Lance. So let's look through those names. I mean, that's not a great group of players who get drafted 3 overall. And this plays to the perception that if you're drafting in the top 5, you are guaranteed a superstar level player. And it's just not the case. I think sometimes people misunderstand the draft. It's having a high pick doesn't necessarily guarantee you that you're going to find a superstar level player. It gives you better odds than picking lower, but it's not that you have better than 50% odds of finding a great player. It's because the salaries are so artificially low for the first 4 years of a player's career. Hitting on one of these picks helps you much more than missing on one of these picks hurts you. So eventually, if you hit on a bunch of draft picks, you can build a tremendous football team. But it's not the case where you should go in just expecting we're going to find a great player, and if we don't, our GM's a fool. Now, your GM may be a fool. Can't rule that out. We've been through plenty of that with the Jets. But it's not the case where you should go in expecting Aaron Donald. And this is probably an error I've made. It's something I've kind of studied recently, and I've kind of seen the error of my ways when we talk about the way these players are evaluated. I mean, I'll go through that list again. Let's talk. Trent Richardson with the Browns, complete bust. Deion Jordan, Dolphins traded up for him, complete bust. Blake Bortles, well, he's a bust. I mean, I know Jacksonville had a good year, but he wasn't the reason they had a good year. Dante Fowler, who is okay. I mean, he's a decent. If he's like your 3rd best pass rusher, he's fine, but not the kind of guy you would expect 3 over. Again, you're expecting a superstar, and Dante Fowler's not a superstar. He's okay if he's like your 3rd best pass rusher. Joey Bosa, okay, superstar there. Absolutely, no question. Solomon Thomas, bust. Sam Darnold, I've heard a thing or two about that guy. Quinnen Williams, Jeff Okudah, not off to a great beginning of his career. Trey Lance, who knows? So, out of all those guys, the only guy you would trade straight up for Quinnen Williams is Joey Bosa. And of the last 10 players picked 3 overall, you got 1 superstar. So Quinnen Williams is not a bad outcome. And keeping him for another year at $10.2 million, he's not a great player, but he's a good player. You could argue he's a very good player. And he may not be the type of guy who's going to consistently make all pro teams, but he's the type of guy who's going to give you credible play. I mean, I don't think this last year was great for him. I think took a step back as far as his run defense went, but he's the type of guy who's going to be pretty good. In a good year, in like maybe his best year, he's the type of guy who I think is going to be a Pro Bowl level player. So I think overall, and I think like this is one of the mistakes we make as Jets fans, is we point the finger at the wrong players for why the Jets aren't good. It's not the Quinnen Williams guys who are causing the Jets to be bad. It's not drafting Quinnen Williams in the 1st round that keeps the Jets from being good. It's not the drafting of Leonard Williams. It's not the drafting of a Jamal Adams. It's drafting Christian Hackenberg in the 2nd round. It's drafting Ardarius Stewart in the 3rd round. It's drafting Lorenzo Malden in the It's never hitting on these picks after the 1st round. And listen, there have been some bad 1st round picks, no question. I mean, that quarterback I mentioned, 3 overall, that one, that one didn't go so well. Darren Lee was not a great pick. Calvin Pryor. There have been some bad picks, but I think we are unfair to Quinnen Williams to an extent when we call him a disappointment or when we say this guy not being a star is the reason the Jets aren't improving. It's not really Quinnen Williams. It's really more the other guys where you're getting absolutely nothing from them, especially round 2, round 3, to a lesser extent round 4. Quinnen Williams is a good player. And I think having him $10.2 million, it's a no-brainer. Now, there's one other catch. The 5th-year option, once the Jets officially pick it up, is guaranteed. And that's another change. In the past, it was not guaranteed until the league year of the player's 5th season began. So essentially what that means is you pick it up before the player's 4th season, and you'd have a year where you could cut the guy with no dead money. And then it became guaranteed once his 5th season began. That's not the case anymore. Now, it's guaranteed the second they pick it up. But $10.2 million for Quinnen Williams, you never know what's going to happen, but on paper right now, where things stand, March 3rd, 2022, that seems like a good value, and that seems like the kind of thing you could be perfectly fine with the Jets having on the books as far as guaranteed money goes. So that was the big news Joe Douglas made, but I thought Robert Saleh, even though he's not at the Combine, gave us some interesting insights to the way the Jets are going to approach this offseason. In fact, he kind of gave us an indication about the way the Jets view positional value, which is always a hotly debated topic among NFL fans. And I'm going to talk about the indications Saleh gave us on the Jets strategy ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast. It, of course, is NFL Combine season. Tonight, the players hit the field for the first athletic drills, but there are no games right now. Basketball, however, is full steam ahead for both pro and college hoops as far as games go. And from all the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline.net is your number one spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all the sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for boxing, hockey, and UFC odds. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or your first watch every day. We're free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, click the subscribe button to get notifications when new episodes are posted. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a thumbs up. It helps out the channel, helps other Jets fans find this podcast. Today we're talking about what Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh had to say yesterday. Lots of cliches, but some interesting points were made. I talked in the first segment about the news Joe Douglas made, which is the Jets are picking up Quinnen Williams' 5th-year option, which on some level I guess was kind of obvious. It was pretty clear that the Jets should do it, in my opinion. But Robert Saleh gave some interesting insight on the way the Jets are going to approach this offseason. He said something about the draft. He was asked about Kyle Hamilton, the Notre Dame safety. The Jets have 2 top 10 picks, of course, and there's all sorts of debate whether the Jets should focus on what are the quote-unquote premium positions or whether picking a safety in the top 10. Hamilton is as highly regarded of a safety prospect as there's been in some time. I mean, I think even you go back to the draft in 2017 with Jamal Adams and Malik Hooker, who were both viewed as top safety prospects, and Adams really fulfilled his promise, whereas Malik Hooker really did not. But I think you'd have to go back to the draft, you'd have to go back to draft classes even further in the past. I mean, I'm talking like Eric Berry, Earl Thomas. That's the kind of hype Kyle Hamilton is getting as a safety prospect. And Saleh was asked about it. Can you take a safety in the top 10? And Saleh's comment was, it depends on how good he is. I call them unicorns. I'd never want to take a linebacker in the first round, but Tremaine Edmonds was sitting there. He's a unicorn at the linebacker world. Same thing with safety. And that's an interesting approach. And I think it's one that kind of strikes the balance because in the National Football League, positions are not created equally. There are some positions that matter more than others. And on your typical defense, it's edge rusher and it's corner that matter the most. So you might say, well, you should only draft edge rushers and corners if you're going to go defense in the first round. That's not always the case. And there's a classic example from Jets history. There's a classic example of any lesson you want to learn from the draft in Jets history. And it's always a mistake. You go back to 2002. This one will bother me forever when the Jets in the first round drafted Brian Thomas over Ed Reed, even though the Jets needed a safety. Now, granted, I don't think any of us knew Ed Reed was going to go down as good as he was. I don't know that any of us thought Ed Reed was going to be the greatest safety of his era, although I think there was a possibility. I mean, he was a very decorated college prospect at Miami. We knew Ed Reed was going to be good. I don't know if we knew how good Ed Reed was going to be, but that's a perfect example of why you can't just exclusively focus on positional value, because the positional value of Brian Thomas is obviously greater than the positional value of Ed Reed, but I think Reed would fit the mold of what Saleh would call a unicorn. So there has to go more into it than just we're taking a player at this specific position. And I think looking for exceptional talent makes a lot of sense to me, because a lot of positional value, it's not so much about the guys at the very top. A great player is a great player. Is linebacker in today's NFL a premium position? Not really. It was in the past. You go back 30 years, linebacker was a position maybe you'd build your defense around. There aren't many defenses built around off-ball linebackers. And I'm not talking about like the edge rusher who stands up, is listed as an outside linebacker. I'm talking about the linebackers who are more just play the run, cover guys. But if you get Ray Lewis is an impact player. And again, like Ed Reed, Troy Polamalu, those are impact guys at safety. I think that one of the big differences between like a safety and an edge rusher is it's not so much that there are no game-changing safeties. It's just there are far less game-changing safeties than there are game-changing edge rushers. There may be only a couple guys at the top. And then there's a very broad and wide middle class at the safety position. So I think that's where Saleh's approach makes sense to me, because you have to find one of the few guys. If you're going to take a safety, it has to be one of the few guys who's at that top level, that game-changing level. I mean, we're talking about the tight end position in the offseason. I've heard some free agent targets for the Jets, and there are some pretty exorbitant contract projections for them. And I hear people say, well, this guy's a top 10 tight end. Well, being a top 10 tight end, how much does that really mean? There are only a couple tight ends at the top who really change your offense, who really keep defensive coordinators up at night. There aren't 10. So being in the top 10 at the tight end position is not the same as being in the top 10 at the wide receiver position, where there are lots of game-breaking players. And the same concept kind of goes, I think, for the defensive side of the ball if you're talking about safety. There's always an opportunity. Every single offseason, you get into like May, June, there's some quality safety who's available who can be signed for cheap. Because finding competent safety play is not that hard. But finding the type of safety who can make the type of impact that, a top corner or a top edge rusher can have, that's very rare. If you find it, it's something worth considering. And I think there's another factor that comes into play, is that there are some defensive schemes where you could argue safety could be a premium position. And depending on the approach the Jets want to take, they might end up running one of those defenses, because this is a Jets defense that last year I thought in many ways tried to de-emphasize the corner position. And the most simplistic way I can put that is they asked corners to cover less ground than corners do in a typical defense. Well, if you're asking less of your corners, that means there's more field to cover for other guys when you're talking about linebackers and you're talking about safeties. And that's a situation where if you have the opportunity to draft a special safety prospect, it's the type of thing where it could make sense. And, there are always going to be concerns. And part of the calculus that has to go into this is that you could be wrong. You could think a player's a unicorn and be wrong. If you think a guy's going to be the best edge rusher in the NFL and he's only like the 15th best, that's still pretty valuable. If you think a safety is going to be the best safety in the NFL and he's only like the 15th best, that's a pretty bad use of a premium resource. So that has to come into the equation as well. But I think that's actually a decent balance to strike, where you're focused more on the premium positions, but if an exceptional opportunity greets you, you're open to it. And it's all about execution. I mean, the Jets have been tremendous over the last few offseasons about laying out plans that make sense on paper. They haven't done such a great job of implementing these plans. So we'll see how the Jets do this offseason. We'll see what their evaluations are. But I think Robert Saleh's comment made some sense. But that's not the only thing Robert Saleh talked about. He spoke in broader terms about what building around Zach Wilson means. I think everybody knows that the Jets' focus this offseason is going to be building around their soon-to-be second-tier quarterback. But Saleh talked about the idea that they can help Zach Wilson out in a rather unconventional way, a way you would not necessarily consider. And I'll explain what he said ahead here on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Thursday, talking about what Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh said yesterday at their NFL Combine press conferences. Although Saleh was not at the Combine, he was speaking remotely to the media, and the topic of building around Zach Wilson came up. Saleh said something interesting, because when we think about building around a quarterback, typically our mindset is building the pieces on offense around him, giving him a good offensive line, giving him a good run game, making sure he's got a tremendous fleet of pass catchers. But Saleh talked about how building up the defense can help Zach Wilson. He mentioned that pretty much building anything around the entire team will assist in Wilson's development. And to me, that makes sense as well. I've spoken about the question about how the Jets approach this offseason. Do they focus exclusively on the offense to give Wilson as many playmakers around him as possible, to give him as good of a line as possible? But there also is something to the idea of improving the defense could be a factor in Wilson's development. Because if you put your quarterback in situations where he has to win shootouts, or you put him in situations where your defense gives up early scores and puts him behind, it's tougher to have success. I think sometimes we underestimate the role game situations have in quarterback performance. I mean, I looked this up, the past 10 years of data in the NFL, and for teams that are ahead, the interception rate is around 2%. That goes up to 2.7% when a team's behind. And it goes all the way up to 2.9%. And this is, again, the last 10 years of data. It goes up to 2.9% when a team's behind by more than one score. And that may not sound like a lot. You say, well, that's like 1%, the difference between being ahead and being behind more than one score. But you have to remember, this is over thousands of throws. And the difference between being a 2% interception guy and a 3% interception guy, pretty big in the NFL. The good quarterbacks in the league are typically 2% and lower, and the lots of bad quarterbacks are 3% and higher. So it does matter. And all you have to do is just think about game situations. If your team's ahead, you can kind of play within yourself. You can play within the system. You don't really need to force anything. Whereas if your team is far behind, you may have to take gambles, and that leads to mistakes. That leads to turnovers. And I don't want to go into like this big psychological thing, but I do think there's something to the idea that you want to make sure a young quarterback has success. And the example I might use is Josh Allen. And I've always wondered how much his ability to run the ball helped him early in his career, where his first couple of years were not great as a passer, but he was at least able to have some success on the ground. And beyond that, they were able to go to the playoffs his second year in Buffalo, and their defense played a role in that. And I think about this. You're not in a situation where you're constantly losing, where you're constantly failing. And I'm not just talking about like the media pressure. I'm not just talking about the fan pressure. I'm talking about just the idea that having success can build your confidence, and having no success can really hurt your confidence. If you're constantly behind and forced to need to throw the ball into tight windows and mistakes happen and your team's losing, I feel like it's probably very easy to lose your confidence, and the reverse is also true. Now, just having team success does not necessarily guarantee you're going to develop. I mean, we've seen enough examples of that. We saw that with Mark Sanchez, where the team had early success. Sanchez was not able to build on that, even though there was lots of positive things happening around him. More recent examples, I mentioned Blake Bortles earlier. They went to the AFC Championship game in Jacksonville. Bortles did not develop. Mitchell Trubisky, they won a division title in Chicago. They had a great defense in 2018. He did not develop. But I think sometimes we underestimate how important it is for a quarterback to have something they can lean on, something that he can point to and say, okay, we're moving forward, we're having some success. It gives you the confidence to continue to develop. I think there's something to that. And I think there's definitely something to the idea that you don't want to put Wilson into these very difficult situations where he has to lead the team. I think you want to take as much off of Wilson's plate as possible. And one way of doing that we don't talk about enough is making sure there's a competent defense that's not getting shredded, that's not putting Wilson behind by 10 points in the first half. A lot of the improvement's going to have to come from Zach Wilson. There's no question about that. But the Jets need to do what they can to help him out. And one of the things they can do to help him out, it goes beyond making sure he's got great pass catchers. It goes beyond making sure he's got a great offensive line. It's also making sure this defense is not getting dominated and putting him in bad game situations every week. So I think, again, we'll see how the implementation is. The Jets have been very good at laying out theories that make sense the last couple of years. Now they got to implement it. But we'll see how they do ahead as we move into the offseason. That's all for today's episode of Locked On Jets. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this show, subscribe to it where you listen to your podcast, or subscribe to it if you're watching on YouTube. And give this episode a thumbs up if you are a YouTube fan of Locked On Jets. It helps this channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find this show. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.